I don't think that there is the greatest driver of all time. Because if we think back in history, there's been Caracciola and Nuvolari, then there's been Fangio, maybe Jim Clark, maybe even a Jackie Stewart, but there's been a Niki Lauda for sure, an Alain Prost and an Ayrton Senna. In their time, they have all been the greatest of their period, of their era. But I don't believe there is one man who is the greatest of all time. But what makes a great driver? What makes a legend? Well, he has to have a talent that is God-given. It's not his own. It's a natural skill that he is gifted with. How those people manage that skill, how they manifest it, how they control it, makes the difference whether they will be the great drivers of their time.
Jackie's right, of course. Motorsport is such that it's even risky to compare the merits of drivers competing against one another. It's even more apt when those drivers haven't raced against one another and have driven under entirely different conditions. Consequently, it's quite impossible to say whether Georges Boileau was one of the greats, but he was, without doubt, the first of the early racers to earn hero status. He was the bravest of all these intrepid competitors who raced in blinding conditions on dusty circuits, driving unsophisticated, dangerously unwieldy and unstable, but already powerful machines. Boileau was leader of the Peugeot team and showed remarkable spirit and incredible bravery as he proudly and single-mindedly fought the armada of conquering Mercedes. This Franco-German battle reached its climax at the French Grand Prix at Lyon on July the 4th, 1914, where Mercedes' tortoise and hare tactic cost Boileau victory in the greatest race of his life. Within a month, however, war had broken out. The conflict would claim the life of Boileau, who was killed in the air over Verdun. When racing restarted early in the 1920s, the French were still at the forefront, with Delage and Bugatti. But the Germans were temporarily uncompetitive and were replaced by the Italians in their Fiats and Alfa Romeos. Felice Nazzaro was the most representative of their clan. Unlike Boileau, Nazzaro was less of a fighter than a stylist, more aware that one had to look after one's equipment to get the best from it. His career wasn't simply brilliant, but also enduring, lasting more than 2 decades. Nazzaro was Fiat's champion. But when they stopped racing at the start of the 20s, it was Alfa Romeo who took control with a formidable duo of drivers. Antonio Ascari, first of all, whose style was so flamboyant that it was frequently described as spectacular and even aerobatic by some contemporary commentators. However, he was killed racing in the wet ACF Grand Prix of 1925 at Montlhéry, at a corner which has borne his name ever since. The other half of the duo was Giuseppe Campari, a bull of a man who had the shape, desire, and maybe even the voice to become an opera singer. He adored eating snails, but fortunately his diet had no influence on his speed. His greatest win was in the ACF Grand Prix of 1924, when he beat Albert Divo and Delage driver Robert Benoit. But just like his teammate, Campari died racing. He had announced that the 1933 Monza Grand Prix would be his last, but he was killed on the very first lap when he lost control on an oil patch, which also claimed the lives of Borrachini and Krikowski. The 30s saw the return of Germany to the motor racing arena, and with their cars came a whole gaggle of drivers, of which the best was Rudi Caracciola, who had no equal in mastering the massive power of the silver arrows on the sinuous curves of the daunting Nürburgring. His style of driving was so elegant that it was almost boring to watch, so perfect and apparently easy was it. It made him almost incomparable in the wet and earned him the name Regenmeister. Thanks to the superiority of their equipment, the Third Reich's drivers almost gave the impression that they had been recruited as promoters of Nazi propaganda. But Caracciola had attracted admiration early in his career when he had demonstrated his generosity, easing up rather than overtaking when his Alfa Romeo teammate began to run out of petrol when heading for victory in the 1932 Monaco Grand Prix. That teammate was an Italian, almost emaciated in stature, but huge in talent and status. His name was Tazio Nuvolari. He was a demon, said his rivals. This Mantovan drove with such obvious bravery and impudence that they maintained that he had to have a pact with the devil himself. He was the winner of 49 Grand Prix, but on the track he behaved as though he would never be beaten.
Era molto tecnico, lui aveva tante conoscenze tecniche e tutti i suoi grandi successi e la sua grande ascesa e la conservazione attraverso vari periodi, perché c'è stata una trasformazione grandissima da fine anni 20 all'anteguerra e anche all'immediato dopoguerra, e lui applicava sempre delle innovazioni alla sua tecnica di guida. La grande invenzione che se l'è trascinata fino ai tempi dell'Auto Union era la capacità di fare il drift, la scivolata su tutte le quattro ruote, in modo leggero, però già importante perché a quei tempi non si faceva.
The rear-engined 500 horsepower Auto Union was a real beast, but the frail-looking Nuvolari was up to the task of taming it, and he could dominate it like no other. But it was in an Alfa Romeo that Nuvolari won the greatest race of his life. In fact, it was in the 1935 German Grand Prix where he gave away 30 horsepower to the Silver Arrows. And in spite of the efficiency of the Mercedes organisation, which saw them gain more than a minute over the Italians in refuelling alone, the little Mantovan won an incredible victory, cocking a snoot at the Nazi dignitaries on their home ground. This champion, whose panache had no equal, perhaps only found a successor worthy of the name 3 decades later, in the shape of another small man with a similar attitude, fired by the same determination and spirit, the Canadian Gilles Villeneuve, who drove for Ferrari from 1978 to 1982. It was a meteoric but unforgettable career.
Di Gilles non si possa dire niente di più di quello che ha fatto vedere a tutti. Era molto generoso, un uomo di grande talento naturale e di grande coraggio, molto semplice, sempre all'attacco, anche quando doveva girare per strada per andare a prendere il gelato, andava forte, faceva i testacoda, si divertiva. Principalmente si divertiva a fare il pilota.
Villeneuve's temperament was well known.
Io penso che per gli episodi che lui ha saputo far vedere agli altri, Gilles sia già un pilota di leggenda. Io voglio ricordare l'episodio, lo chiamavano il pilota volante, perché ha fatto un mare di incidenti all'inizio quando imparava. L'episodio di Zandvoort quando è rientrato al box su 3 ruote. Non era un pilota che si era costruito, un pilota così, naturale, era veloce, con qualsiasi tipo di macchina in qualsiasi situazione.
The most famous race in Villeneuve's sparkling career was his incredible wheel-to-wheel, and we mean sometimes wheel-against-wheel, battle with René Arnoux in the closing laps of the 1979 French Grand Prix at Dijon. This was a fight to the flag, both drivers desperate to beat the other. For second place, remember, and doing all that they could while staying just within the boundaries of sport and safety. It was a duel etched in the memories of all those who saw it, one of Formula One's greatest battles. But let's go back, chronologically speaking. When racing restarted in the late 40s, it was the older drivers whose careers had been interrupted by the war who featured. Nuvolari was in decline. The new stars were Giuseppe Farina, Jean-Pierre Vimy, Raymond Sommer, Luigi Villoresi, Alberto Ascari. In 1948, the Alfas dominated and Vimy won 2 out of the 4 major races that year. The future looked great for this Frenchman, but his career was cruelly cut short by his death when driving a Gordini at Buenos Aires at the end of the year. The driver who would become the most honoured in the history of the sport came from Argentina. Juan Manuel Fangio was certainly the most successful of the drivers in the 50s, and his record of 5 World Championship titles still stands today, more than 40 years after its inception in 1950. That first World Championship was won by the experienced driver Farina, the first driver to adopt a straight-arm driving technique. But when the Italian lost form, it was the Argentine who developed into a winner, and he took his revenge in having been beaten by Farina in 1950 by winning his first title the following year. Fangio certainly dominated his era, but he had a rival in the shape of the English driver Stirling Moss, the most talented of the new generation.
Yo vi a Moss, primera vez que vine a Europa, él era un jovencito. Su padre le autorizaba las carreras, lo vi correr en Monza y me llamó mucho la atención cómo se arrimaba a las curvas y frenaba a último momento.
Moss, in fact, was the inventor of the technique of late braking in a corner right up to the apex, a technique which would later be universally adopted by all drivers. He was a graduate of the British 500cc class of racing, brilliant and persevering at the same time. After an apprenticeship in outclassed and outdated British Grand Prix cars, he seemed destined to become #1. But he came up against Fangio, his major rival and therefore also the man with whom he would most be compared. Consequently, he would be destined to be remembered most as the uncrowned champion. Was it simply bad luck? Partially, but perhaps also because he was very independent and perhaps too nationalistic, which saw him conduct his career less well than his cars, leading to inopportune choices of team which prevented him from driving the best cars. It was the greatest shame. He had so much talent.
I was always felt as a fighter. It's my car, you know, whatever happened, if I'm still running, I'm going to try and win, even if it's not impossible. You've always got this fastest lap to go to or something. And I think having that attitude, having the attitude of wanting to be a fighter, I think is a very important thing. There are things that I don't know if Fangio had them or not. He was so good, one doesn't really know whether he was a fighter or whether he wasn't.
One of Moss's greatest races was the 1961 Monaco Grand Prix, where he beat the more powerful Ferraris in his little underpowered Lotus, whose agility around the Monegasque streets he exploited to the full. Moss frequently demonstrated his brilliance and came so close to the ultimate reward of that elusive title. 3 times he finished second to Fangio and lost the title by 1 point to Hawthorn in 1958. Fangio's retirement gave Moss his best chance, but a serious accident at Goodwood meant that the title would never be his, even though he attempted a comeback.
When I went to try myself out, my lap times round the circuit were reasonable, but I could see that what had before been normal and natural to me was not. I mean, I'd go into a corner and suddenly think, my God, I must brake now. I must get over here. I had to work out what I had to do, whereas before it had all been natural. And I felt it was unrealistic to continue.
It was more the way they conducted their careers than the way they drove that marked the difference between Moss and Fangio. Apart from being extraordinarily talented, the Argentine was also remarkably astute. He changed teams at just the right moment, unerringly joining a team just when it was coming good. He was a protégé of Argentina's dictator Perón, who sent him to Europe in the late 40s. Fangio won his first title with Alfa Romeo in 1951, before 2 lean years without a competitive car. It was a lesson well learnt. This meagre period ended with his joining Mercedes as team leader, the German team returning to Grand Prix racing with extremely advanced machines which would outclass their rivals. Similarly, Fangio would outclass his teammates, winning his second world title easily, ahead of Ferrari drivers Gonzalez and Hawthorne. Physically, Fangio made an unlikely racing driver. He wasn't very tall, slightly plump, he spoke in a light, high voice and seemed almost reserved. But that was countered by his nose and steel blue eyes, which gave him the hungry look of an eagle. He drove with minute precision, and his mechanical background meant that he could bring home the most weary of machines. He was over 40 in 1955, but still managed to repress his new teammate, Stirling Moss, 18 years his junior.
I remember going to Monte Carlo, and Fangio did a one, whatever the lap was, and I went out just after that. I took a 10th off, and I will do it. Came in, took my gloves off. He'd done another 10th off mine. Then I went out, took a 10th off his, and so on. So it went on until in the end, Neubauer said, "Look, cut it out." The point is that whatever is possible, like Bannister did a 4-minute mile, he would have done a 3:59.9, and whatever you'd done, he could always do that fraction more. Fangio is without doubt the greatest driver who's ever lived. I think there are other drivers who approach him on speed, but there's never been a driver that's approached him as a complete entity of a man. I'm talking now Formula One, where he was the ultimate.
In 2 seasons with Mercedes, he won 8 out of 12 Grand Prix, plus 2 World Championships to add to his first. But the German team was pulling out of racing. He moved to Ferrari for 1956, a team that he distrusted, but which held him in high regard. The atmosphere got worse and worse during the year, but Fangio still managed to win the title, just ahead of Moss and his Maserati. Fangio was well placed to appreciate the qualities of the 250F and moved to the Works team for 1957, while Moss went to Vanwall. The Argentine made the best choice, winning his 5th world title. It was during this season that he scored the greatest victory of his career. A tardy pit stop in the German Grand Prix saw him nearly 50 seconds behind the scrapping Ferrari pair, Hawthorne and Collins. But on this day, Fangio was in masterly form, the Maserati flying around the sinuous Nürburgring. He not only caught the Lancia Ferraris, but overtook them and won by 3 seconds. Only a truly exceptional champion could succeed in such a gargantuan task. But this would be his 24th and final win. Once the fuss had died down, and with his 5th world title won, this 47-year-old, still clearly a force to be reckoned with, went for another championship in 1958, only to retire in mid-season.
Cuando fui a correr a Rennes, mi coche primero no se mantenía bien, que era una de las particularidades más exponentes de Maserati. Entonces yo pregunto a Guarino, ¿qué pasa con el coche que no se tiene? Dijo, cambiamos los amortiguadores. Pero ¿y por qué? Si los otros andaban bien. Me dijo, no, porque estos pagan. Entonces yo me di cuenta que la cosa ya era distinto. Dije, ellos pagan, pero soy yo el que corro en el auto. Y largamos la carrera y a las 15 vueltas se rompió el pedal del embriague. Me quedé sin el embriague. Así que me paré en el box, le di el pedal, lo tenía ahí en el piso, y ellos me pidieron por favor que siguiera. Me empujaron el auto y seguí. Y llegué cuarto. Yo soy un hombre que creo en el destino. Quizás me ayudó mucho la suerte y el destino. Y ya tenía más de 46 años. Ya tenía que esforzar más que los jóvenes de 20, 25, 22. Y que esa fue una decisión que tomé en ese momento y nunca me arrepentí de eso. Usted sabe que siempre está quien lo alaba, quien le dice, sos el mejor, a vos sos imbatible, y el peligro es creerse que es el mejor. Claro, así que esto, dije, es el momento oportuno para dejar las carreras.
He retired as the reigning world champion, and his remarkable record made him the racing driver of the era, the example of the perfect driver. 3 decades later, his fame and success are still legendary. In the early 60s came another legend, a man whose speed and perfection had his rivals and spectators alike gasping in admiration, Jim Clark. Clark was a driver of class. The way he came alive in a racing car, particularly at the start of a race, was symbolic of his career, meteoric.
Jim Clark was first and foremost a Scottish farmer. He really wasn't made to be a racing driver. He was introverted, he was shy, he was really a man who felt more at home on his farm, on his land, with his sheep and with his farm workers and fellow Scots.
But Clark was one of those lucky sportsmen who possessed unique natural talent. All he needed was the catalyst to draw it out of him. And that catalyst was Colin Chapman, the man behind Lotus. Together, they performed miracles. From an apprenticeship in Formula Junior, Clark went on to be the first great Formula One champion of what was then the dawning age of rear-engined cars. He outclassed his rivals with serene confidence. Throughout his career, he would remain a Lotus driver and dominated the 1963 and then 1965 World Championships.
Jim Clark was the best racing driver I ever raced against. He was so smooth, so precise. He did it so naturally. He seemed to take so little out of his car. He always seemed to be going slowly, and yet he was going very fast. If there's a driver that I modelled myself on, it would be Jim Clark.
During his relatively short but brilliant Formula One career, Jim Clark established several remarkable records which stood for many years before being either equalled or broken. He won 25 Grand Prix, one more than Fangio. Started from pole 33 times, a record only beaten by Senna a quarter of a century later. And 7 of Clark's poles were in one season, when there were only 10 races in total. Remember, it was to Lotus and Jim Clark that Ford would entrust their new Cosworth DFV V8, and Clark won with it first time out at Zandvoort in 1967. The shape of contemporary Grand Prix cars during Clark's heyday somehow seemed to match his own speed and style, particularly on the ultra-fast circuits where precision was all important. He was a master of Spa, even though he hated the place, where his 1964 race average was nearly 133 mph in a 1.5-litre car. 4 times he won in Belgium from 1962 to 1965. He was a 4-time winner in England too. Clark finished the 1967 season on a high with 2 consecutive victories in America and Mexico. The Clark, Chapman, Duckworth trio seemed invincible, a driver with style and 2 geniuses providing his equipment. Who could rival it? They seemed set for a lengthy reign, even if the driver was indicating that he would like to retire and return to his farm in Scotland. The 1967 title had gone to Denny Hulme, but there seemed every likelihood that a 3rd world title would come Clark's way. Sadly, this was not to be. On a miserable April afternoon at the perilous Hockenheim in 1968, Clark was driving in an unrewarding Formula 2 race. For no traceable reason, although probably technical, his Lotus left the road at high speed and disappeared into the unprotected forest. There, an artist perished.